woven together in elusive cohesion, themes of motherhood, climate change, and the relationship between words and visual art are packaged together beautifully into Danielle Dutton's small and strange collection of texts, Prairie, Dresses, Art, Other. This uncategorizable book is an intriguing blend of fiction, prose, essays, curation, and at the very end, a play involving an interactive audience. Dutton, a professor at Washington University and co-founder of the independent publisher Dorothy, has a distinct, compelling, challenging voice in experimental writing, as seen in her many books, short stories, and articles published over the years. Hear Dutton, in conversation, describe the big ideas behind her latest book, Prairie, Dresses, Art, Other. Danielle Dutton, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I want to just jump right in and talk about what an interesting collection this is. I've never read any of your work before, so I'm very new to your style. And I wanted you to kind of give a summary in your own words of what this is.
This book?
Yeah.
I mean, it is a sort of strange collection. So Prairie, Dresses, Art, Other. The book happens in 4 sections, and the first one is Prairie, the second is Dresses, the third is Art, the fourth is Other. And they're quite distinct from each other, but they also, to my mind, have a lot to say to each other. So the first section, Prairie, is a collection. It's sort of like a cycle of 5 stories that take place in the Midwest and sometimes in or on the prairie. And they feel like they go together, sort of stylistically and tonally. And then the second section, Dresses, is a completely different thing. It's a collage piece. It's actually a piece called 66 Dresses I have read. And it's pieces of like excerpts from literature, from a bunch of different stuff, from a bunch of different writers and eras that have a dress in them that I was interested in. So it's like a collage closet of literary dresses. And then Other is an essay about my thoughts about the relationship between fiction and visual art and the way visual art works in my own writing. And then the last section, so now we have stories, a weird collage thing that I also think of as like a weird art piece almost, and then an essay on art and fiction. And then to me, the final section, Other, all of those pieces are sort of, I feel like the first 3 sections like extrude the final section. Like they're all stories that are kind of weirdly essayistic and sometimes enacting the ideas that I talk about in the essay. And then at the very end, we pick back up with the prairie in the last piece in the Other section, which is actually a play. So it's just like a lot of different things. And I think it's just a very playful, formally playful piece, yeah.
Yeah. So did you like arrive at the concept before going into each text, or like did you just start writing and like happen to bring it all together in this way?
Yeah, more the latter. So I my last book came out 8 years ago, and then after that, I just felt really quiet for a long time in my brain. And as I started writing, I was just writing in kind of different directions, or they seemed different to me. And it wasn't for several years that I started to realize that I was doing this work with the Prairie for a while, but I didn't think it was something I was going to sustain for an entire book. And then, honestly, like one day this title came to me. I basically came up with this idea that maybe they all belong together. And once I did that, there was more work then to do to make them work together as a book, as opposed to like me throwing a bunch of random stuff together. And the connections between them became clearer and clearer to me as I worked on the book.
So can we talk more about the significance of prairies and dresses and art for you in your life?
Yeah. So I'm from California, and I went to, I moved to Chicago when I was in my mid-20s, which is technically in Prairie land, but I didn't really ever see any prairies or think about prairies there. And then I moved to Denver to do my PhD. And then after Denver, my husband and I moved to downstate Illinois. And that was where I first encountered prairies. We were living in Urbana, Illinois. And there's a lot of sort of I don't know, almost like prairie activism there, people trying to preserve and reclaim prairie spaces, and a lot of native plant planting going on in Urbana. And I just was like, what's a prairie? And there are parks there that are educational parks where you move through and there are plaques that like describe how the prairie used to be in Illinois, let's say, or in that area, how much land was prairie, what the prairie was like, why it's important ecologically and as a habitat, and how much remains, which is like a really sadly small amount. But so I was interested in all of that, but I also was just like extremely struck by the space of the prairie, sort of emotionally and aesthetically. I just felt very, very drawn to it. And so I was already around 30 or something when this was happening. And I love being inside of a prairie. So I started wanting to do prairie walks. And then when we moved here to Missouri 12 years ago, we started finding prairie walks that we could get to on short drives outside of St. Louis. And I would just want to go back all the time. Or there are pockets of Forest Park that are preserved for prairie spaces. And we would constantly go to those. And I just started writing. Prairies just started entering into my work, and I think there was always something a little sad about the prairie to me because I came to it knowing how little prairie is left. And so the stories in the prairie section are all kind of tonally, there's something fearful and sad about them. And that's not only because of the prairie, that's a bunch of like political stuff, personal stuff, but the prairie felt like it fit tonally in that. I mean, I find the prairie so beautiful, but there's just a sadness that I have thinking about them because there's so little of them left. I think there's like 50,000 acres of prairie left in Missouri that would have been like many millions of acres originally, and they call them remnant prairies, which I just found so, I don't know, evocative but sad. So that's prairies. Oh my gosh, I went off on prairies forever. Dresses, well, I'm not much of a dresser. Like I've never been that into fashion, but I love reading about dresses. And my last book is a historical novel about this super interesting eccentric woman named Margaret Cavendish. She was a duchess in the 17th century in England, and she was famous for wearing super eccentric clothes. But what she was wearing has been lost to history. And so something I did in writing that novel was I got to invent her dresses, and I made them wild. Like she had one dress that was supposed to look, I wrote it to look like the forest floor. So it was like covered in mushrooms and cobwebs and beetle wings and stuff. And so I just like went kind of nuts writing Margaret Cavendish's dresses, and I think that got me noticing dresses everywhere I was when I was reading. And so I just started collecting them. But the title, 66 Dresses I Have Read, literally came to me in a dream. And I woke up and I was like, oh, I should write down 66 dresses I have read. But then I got really into doing that and curating it, and it became quite meaningful and sort of moving to me when I started collecting them and putting them together. Like what they were saying to each other was really interesting to me. And then art, visual art, I was saying before that I went to the School of the Art Institute for my MFA, and so I sort of came into being a writer in a space that was really attentive to visual art in particular, and so it's just always been a part of my writing practice, and I often go to visual art when I want to start writing for a lot of different reasons I could go into, but I've been talking long enough.
Well, so to elaborate on that, like so much of what you write, and you write about this concept is writing about art, right? And bringing in references in direct and indirect ways. And like, you exemplify that in the Prairie section, and then it's like more of a visual art piece kind of in Dresses, and then it's like written about in art. So like that's clearly a very important part of what you do. And even like I was looking at like the classes you teach at WashU, and like that's a big, it's a subject you address a lot. So I'm just curious about like your thoughts on, it's called ekphrasis, and why is that meaningful to you?
Yeah. I mean, I don't even think I knew. So ekphrasis is the idea that it's sort of classically the definition of ekphrasis is sort of like a description of visual art inside of a text. And I didn't know what ekphrasis was. I mean, and I had been interested in thinking about visual art in my writing before I knew what ekphrasis was. So when I learned what ekphrasis was, I didn't really like the definitions of it. It felt kind of boring to me. I was interested in doing not descriptions of visual art in my writing, but I was interested in writing both my own and other people's. And that's kind of what the essay is about. That sort of like try to absorb or almost like swallow a work of visual art and contain it in language in a really strange way, so that you're having a kind of weird, whether it's like an installation or a visual experience inside of a text. And I'm also interested in why I go to visual art to write. And I think it's because I often find visual art really destabilizing in productive ways. And so when I feel kind of destabilized and like awake to the world in a new way from a work of visual art, it's like I want to go write then, because the world feels like freshly strange and interesting to me. So prairies were like a source of inspiration, and visual art has long been a source of inspiration too.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned at some point, so for some context, you wrote Sprawl, which is about Laura Latinsky's photo series about. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, so I wouldn't say the book is about them. It's an experimental novel. It's sort of about the suburbs, but I ekphrastically was using Laura Latinsky's photographs from a series called Hardly More Than Ever, that are these images, they're domestic still lives, and I was really interested in the still life tradition, which obviously started in painting. But her still lives are really interesting because things are often like on the edges of tables, like teacups or crystal or, stemware or something, like as if everything's about to fall apart. I don't know, or some party just happened. Like it's like a big, beautiful mess. And I was really interested in them, and I was sort of pulling them into my writing, but not describing them so much as like taxonomizing them. So I would list the items in the photographs within you don't know when that's happening when you're reading the book, but there are these lists that are actually lists from her images throughout the book of the things that appear in her photographs.
At some point in the book, you also talk about the desire to write about nothing, or the desire to like evoke, to evoke something without saying something, and like how do you do that when you're writing? You have to say something.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm just curious because you write about it so well, this idea of like what you're reading, translating so clearly to like what you would be seeing otherwise, or hearing, I don't know if you have more to add to that. It's just an interesting thing.
I mean, I think speaking of my teaching, something I often am talking about with my students is, I feel like we get trained somehow to read for the answer. Like you're supposed to read a poem or a story and then like take the meaning out of the story and like put it over here, and now you know what it was about or like what its point was. Like my students will often want to know what the point of a story is. And I'm often encouraging them to think like of it as an experience. The way when you go walk through an art installation or up to a painting, I don't feel the need to like take a point out of it or it's like unlock its secret meaning. It's more that I'm experiencing it and it's having an effect on me intellectually, aesthetically, physically, emotionally, whatever. And I often want stories to be allowed to be like that, a kind of experience you've moved through, and then at the end you're like, whoa, I just moved through that experience, not that I have to say, and the point of it was this. So I think that's in the realm of what you're asking about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I see that a lot in your fiction too. So like in the first section, you've got these characters. You don't have any like context for who the narrator is, who the person we're focusing on is, or their relation to other people or things in the world. Things are just happening, and often like fluidly shifting from like inside the mind to outside to like this thought to that, and it's such a like it works as such a stream of consciousness almost, and it to me reads as the same thing. So I really do like adore your fiction.
Oh, thank you.
Sense.
That's so nice. I loved your description of it.
To go back to teaching, I'm wondering like how you teach something like this, like style.
Oh, well, I try not to teach style. I try to support style, when I see it in my students' work. And let's say I have a style as a writer. I don't know. Let's say that's true. I would never want to impose it on someone else. I wouldn't want them to write like me or like some other particular writer. I want them to like figure out what's weird and interesting and specific about them and like how that translates into their prose, since I teach prose writing. But I do, like when I teach this class called Fiction and the Visual, which is very much like about a lot of the stuff I'm talking about in the art essay, or there's some overlap anyway, I preface it by saying like, this is a completely bonkers class. Like to be in this class, you want to be someone who wants to think about how a story works like a sculpture, or how there might be eyeballs in a story and how they move around and like what is seen in a story and how does looking work inside of a story. And so if that sounds annoying to you or like something you don't want to do, this isn't the right class for you, And I feel like that's really helpful, just getting students into a space where they know we're going to be thinking a little differently. And most of them are completely excited to do that. And we have lots of fun trying to write we'll pick art forms and try to write like sculpture or try to write like an etching. Like what would it mean to try to think about your story as an etching? How would that change what you do as a fiction writer? So we do fun, weird stuff like that. And I try to push them into like new and weird places.
I want to come back to Sprawl for a second and talk about your relationship with Laura Latinsky. And because, again, you write about, I think it's in the art essay that you have, about the sort of like, maybe it's not parasocial, but the relationship you form when you take someone else's art and write about it or collaborate with it in like a way that they're not necessarily involved with directly. And so like, what, like you talked to about like consent and like the idea that someone is not necessarily willingly contributing to what you're making, which in a sense is everything we make. Yeah. But I guess, could you speak to the relationship you form when you are talking about art or writing about it from other artists?
Yeah, I mean, Laura Latinsky is a good example because when I was writing Sprawl, I had come across I think it was the Renaissance Society of Chicago put out this beautiful hardbound book with the Hardly More Than Ever series in it, and I had come across it, and I was like completely struck by it, and it just started making its way into my writing. And so I worked on that book for years, and I did not know Laura Latinsky. I didn't even look her up. I didn't try to find out who she was or what she was about. I was just dealing with the material of those photographs. But then once the book was actually a book in the world, a physical book, it occurred to me that I should probably send it to her. And I had also by that point met someone who knew what I was doing, who knew her, and I found out she teaches at the University of Chicago. I mean, I didn't know any of this. Suddenly she was like this real person who wasn't even that far away because I was living in Urbana at the time. So I found her, I think, like faculty address or something and packaged up the book and wrote a letter and mailed it to her. And I say in the essay that my hands were shaking when I did that because it just, I honestly hadn't thought about it until then, but that I had taken her work and done something with it. And my question to myself was like, had I done something to it also? And physically, of course, no. I hadn't touched it. I'd never even seen any of her photographs in person at that point, just in the book. But that's when I started wondering, when she became a real person to me, I started wondering about this idea that there's something in ekphrasis that's like actually collaborative, but not always with a willing or even living participant. And like, just what does that mean? How can it or should it affect what we do with work? Although, of course, like you're implying, I mean, that's kind of how art works. Like you're constantly taking inspiration from all different places. So, I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't. It just felt productive to me to like think about it that way. And so I sent it to her, but we have since become friends, and everything's okay. And she even asked me to write something when she was having a gallery show in Chicago a few years ago to like write the catalog copy as a kind of weird story. And that's in here as well in the other section. So it's become like a reciprocal, really cool relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a happy ending to that
story.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to ask something a bit more abstract. You don't have to answer this, but you do in your book talk about like just the inclusion of references and like how the sort of perspective or point of origin can get muddled. And it made me think about like meme culture and internet culture and the fact that like so much of like what's online is a reference of a reference of a reference, you know, like 1,000 times over, and like no context is ever given. Like things just are, and you either get it or you don't. You can't be explained to you. And like I just feel like, you know, everything is a reference of something because, you know, like we were talking about, like we're all inspired by other things, but I just feel like with like the acceleration of like, you know, memes and internet culture, we're approaching this like referential like content stream that is like, I don't know, I guess I'm wondering, like, do you think there's like an end point to this? Like, does it, I don't know. I think I just want to have like a mini conversation about like how absurd it is.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can't because I'm so old. I'm so outside meme culture that my teenage son frequently has to try to explain. And it is this sort of like eternal return where I can't seem to understand back to the original referent.
Right.
And I mean, I think frequently he's just like, forget it. So I don't know, but I can say just kind of related that one of my favorite writers is this Mexican author, Cristina Rivera Garza, and she has this, I'm quoting her, but she says that when we write with others inescapably. And I love this idea, and I do think that that's true. And I mean, maybe it's just true when we make, period, you know, that we're constantly making with others, whether we're acknowledging it or not. And so, yeah, my book is full of references inside of the writing, and then at the end, there's stuff that I want to make sure people know was in there that I was working with, even if I didn't like reference it in the pieces themselves. And I'm sure I've forgotten things or didn't ever even know that I was dealing with them. But that's just how culture works. And I'm not listing them as like an apology. It's more that I find the whole thing really fascinating. Like, I've always felt that I'm writing with others inescapably, and that's part of what's interesting to me, that being part of that conversation and like carrying things forward, reaching back to other things. I was a history major as undergrad. I think there's just like inherently something interesting about that to me. But that's nothing about meme culture, or maybe it is. I don't know.
You know, honestly, I think there is something to be said about that. There are a lot of things that like trickle through this book. You know, in addition to these 4 categories, you've got like sort of themes that come through and weave through and connect everything in a really cohesive way. And one of those things is climate change. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting because like you write about it in a direct way, but there's something very like, instead of it being this like in-your-face thing that you talk about, for me when I was reading it, it felt more like this like sort of nagging, you know, in the back of your head that like you forget about at some points, but then like something reminds you of it and it's there again, you know, and you write it in that way that I think a lot of us process it, where it's like always there. Sometimes we try to acknowledge it, try to forget about it, but like it's not going away. So I don't know if you have any words on like how you choose to write about it, because it's such an urgent and like immediate thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I wanted it to do exactly what you just described, because that is my experience of living with it. I mean, I find it very urgent, very heartbreaking, very upsetting all the time. And I was with a professor at WashU, Melanie Messier. I've co-taught a course called Fiction of the Anthropocene a couple of times, and we spend the whole semester reading works that are engaging with climate change, talking about climate change. How can it be written about, you know, and thinking through those questions. And by the end of the semester, we're all like so depressed because we've been putting our attention in this really depressing, upsetting space for the whole semester. And so I think it is natural to just want to like turn your attention away sometimes, just to be able to exist, not in a state of constant despair. So I think I wanted to just be honest about that, not talking about it, but just the way it would infiltrate the work, where it's like, yeah, I honestly try to forget about it some days. And then sometimes I just forget about it because I'm busy and other things are happening and taking up my attention. And then it comes rushing back. And I feel just like this, you know, ball of despair again walking. I mean, it's pretty frequent, you know. So like the irises in my yard right now, I think part of what's so weird about it is that some of the effects right now, at least in St. Louis, are sort of like pleasant. Like it seems like we have less cold and gray weather in the winter, and like spring comes sooner. And it's like there's this wonderful word that Mel Massir and I discovered in our research for the class, and we share with our students, called blissonance, that someone came up with to describe like the peculiar feeling of when things, because of climate change, things are momentarily nicer, and you're blissful about it, but there's a dissonance to it because it's wrong. So like the irises in my yard, for like the first 5 years we lived here, they bloomed on Mother's Day, like every single year, and they are blooming right now when we left the house. And it's just a few weeks early, no big deal. But then my mind just starts racing forward, wondering like, are they going to start blooming in January? It seems like we've been here 12 years. That's a pretty big change. And I know we just got changed to like gardening zone 7 for St. Louis.
What does that mean?
I think I'm not a gardener. I'm just like an appreciator of plants. But I think it means we're in a warmer zone, like officially, for people who are out in their yards gardening and need to know like when you plant what and what will grow here and what can survive. And there's like real tangible change, in these little ways right here. I'm just speaking about St. Louis. There's really dramatic change elsewhere. I don't want my fiction to be didactic, but I don't want to pretend that this isn't like a constant part of my life either. So I like the idea that it's just sort of like this nagging that comes forward sometimes. Feels right.
Yeah, you do it really well. It's very reminiscent of, I think, how we process it in general. I have just a couple more questions. One, how did you reach the point where you knew that this collection was complete?
Oh my gosh, that is one of the hardest things to know. So I think I've come up with an answer for how I know when a story is complete. And it's when I've so completely exhausted it for myself that I know why every single word is exactly that word, and every comma. You know what I mean? Like I've really considered every single little tiny micro part of it. For the collection, it actually went through transformation even after my agent sent it out the first time. I cut some stories from the other section. I think I rearranged the Prairie section, and then I added Pool of Tears, which is the play at the end that wasn't even part of it when it first went out on submission. I mean, very quickly after that, I was like, wait, stop. So it's hard to know when it's right. And then it sort of settles down, and, I feel now I feel like it's right. And the funny thing is that at the last minute, there were two things I was thinking of cutting from the other section. I just wasn't sure. And those are the two things people keep saying, like, oh my gosh, I loved this piece, which is, it's just, you don't know, And my last novel, Margaret the First, I know lots of writers do this, but when I was giving readings from it, I was constantly editing in the margins or crossing things out sometimes it never feels completely done. But for the moment, this does feel quite done to me, but it's happened very slowly. I don't think There's not a way you can know. You just have to decide.
Yeah.
It's over.
That's the scary part. You could go on forever, in theory.
Yeah, that's right.
But where you cut it off is great. I do love it as is.
Thanks.
Can we talk about Dorothy?
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is, how it started?
Yeah, so Dorothy, a Publishing Project, is the press I run with my husband, Martin Riker. And it's an independent, small, some people call it a micro press, feminist press that we started, I guess, 15 years ago. We started it in 2009. The first books came out in 2010. And we publish just 2 books every year together in the fall. Well, most years. That's our publishing model, but every once in a while it gets messed up. This fall, we're going to be doing 3 books, but we have a reason why we're doing that, because 2 are by the same writer. And it's just the press we do together. It's a huge part of our marriage. That's one important thing about it. It's a lot of, Marty and I have a lot of fun doing it together. And it's named for my great-aunt Dorothy, who was my dad's aunt, and he was very close to her. She was very important in his life, and she was a librarian. And she went to library school and had a degree in library science. Most of her peers were men. She was early, sort of a trailblazer to be. She was head librarian of San Bernardino County in California, which is like the largest by land mass, like the largest county in California, but very rural. And so it's like just very impressive librarian person. And she drove a Woody station wagon bookmobile filled with books around the desert to like underserved communities so that they could have library access. She was just a really interesting person. She was like what people called then a spinster. And she was for a while a children's librarian, and she loved children's books. And so my experience, I grew up in a kind of rural part of Central California. She lived in this sort of rural part of Southern California. And she would send me on my birthdays a beautiful edition of a children's book stamped inside with an owl book plate, in which she would write, there was like a space to write something at the top and something at the bottom. And she had this like, by the time I was a child, she was quite old, and she had a kind of like shaky hand, and she would write to Danielle up at the top, and there was an owl, and then she would write from Dorothy at the bottom, and I would get them regularly, and they're always like beautiful. I think that it was, these gifts were part of what taught me to love books as objects beyond just loving reading, and that's a big part of the press. Is I do all the book design. I sort of do fetishize the book as an object, which is maybe silly, but it seems innate to me. And yeah, so Dorothy was the inspiration for the name, and in some ways for what we do. Yeah, we're going strong. We're just sending out galleys for our fall books right now. So this, I think it's our 15th year. I can't really do math, but it's been a while now.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. What do you look for in books?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking for things that feel quite singular, really. Things that we're not seeing elsewhere, like a voice or an energy or a form, a style that just feels like, where is this coming from? Who is this writer? So we're often really interested in debuting authors and working with them on their first books. That's something that we do. We've done a few reprints of lost or forgotten books or writers, although, they weren't lost or forgotten. They just fell out of fashion or something. And we've done translations. So there's like a wide range of books that we've done, but we're always just looking for, writing with a lot of energy in the prose. And I guess would be considered innovative, although, that word seems to just confuse as much as it helps clarify sometimes. But originally, we were always interested in publishing innovative fiction by women, mostly women.
Mm-hmm. I have one more question. Mm-hmm. What are your goals moving forward? And I mean that in like a professional way, like what do you hope to accomplish, but also in terms of like, I feel like as a creative, you're always like maybe chipping away at something or trying to get to some emotional or some kind of state. And I'm wondering if there's anything for you that you're like working towards in that sort of more abstract sense.
Mm-hmm. I'm working on a new book, so I would really like to finish that book. That's like my really practical goal right now. But some things I'm working out in this book is, it's the first thing I've ever written where I'm not really using much source material in the way I have in all of my previous books. It's not ekphrastic. It's not in conversation with other texts or writers in that really overt way. So that's been really interesting, and I've been trying to write into shame a little bit in a way that I never have before, and be very direct and clear about that. I think shame is like a part of my writing always, but like in these covert ways that are there as it's there as an engine sometimes, but I'm using its energy, or I'm writing around it, and I'm trying to write into it in a different ways. And that just feels like, despite all the things some of my previous books have in common, to me they are all quite distinct from each other, and I'm excited to be like yet again inside of like just a different space and playing around in there. So that's it. Just this one book. Simple, practical goals.
Yeah. Very excited. Danielle, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. This was lovely.